So I'm very delighted to be here and thank you for the invitation. Thanks to Headway UK. And this is a topic that has been present with me throughout my clinical work. And currently I work in a university role. I'm mostly involved in research side of things and maintain an interest in identity change, but taking a slightly different angle. So I think I'll be talking today about work that sort of represents, or ideas that represent, sort of about 20 years of amassed experience in different settings and taking different approaches. But I think it's a really key one, in at the beginning of my journey, asking people what their emotional needs were about relating to brain injury and trying to make sense of how we might treat that. In about 2001, people said, I want the old me back. It's one of the first things on people's sort of shopping lists in a rehab setting. So that became the focus, really. So I'm just trying to change. Okay, there we go. So for this webinar, there are kind of four areas that I'll cover. What do we mean by self and identity in general? Then thinking about how brain injury can affect self and identity. Then feeding into one of the key things I worked on some years ago, and it seems to be still quite popular, which is the Y-shaped model. I'll talk a little bit about that. And then that'll flow into kind of some ideas about what can be done to help manage identity changes. So let's start by thinking about what we mean by self and identity. Obviously, I'm a psychologist, so I'm going to approach this from a psychology point of view. And it's obviously, as psychology is awash with ideas about self and identity, it's a huge topic. So I've basically got sort of two slides covering two angles on it, but it's not chapter and verse. Two key areas that I think are important when we think about brain injury and identity. So first of all is the social approach. This is the kind of thinking about self and identity in the context of our social experiences. And so the idea is that our identity comes from and is defined by our social experiences, the groups we belong to, the activities we do, etc. So there's many different theories, but Tajfel and Turner, social identity theory is one of them. And this idea is that identity is defined as the we, the people we spend time with, engaging in shared activities where we feel we belong, where we identify with those people. And in those relationships, we might have people who we aspire to be like within those groups. We might have relationships that are particularly meaningful. So it's more than just the activity, and those activities could be across a range of different things. Obviously there's our families and the family relationships we have, and then other things that we engage in, at work, and different aspects of the roles that we have at work. Sport, religion, cultural practices, different leisure activities, music, dance, you name it, all of these different things that we can be involved in kind of define us. But the important thing here is that identity is defined through our identification with the relationships we have in those settings. And this means that when it's all going well, we sort of feel we fit in, we feel we belong. We engage in things within those groups that define ourselves as being like the people that we like spending time with, and unlike those other people who we don't like so much, or who we disagree with, or we feel less comfortable, or we don't feel we belong with. And we engage in these social processes sort of perhaps sometimes a little out of our own awareness, but we tend to do things that kind of help us to identify and fit in with those groups. I think that's about all I'm going to say. I hope that makes sense, but it's a kind of activity, relationships, fitting in, belonging, and defining ourselves as like these people, but unlike those other people. One other thing to say is within the sort of field of health, people are interested in social identity theory because they say, actually, we get quite a lot from these groups and relationships in terms of things like emotional support and practical support. So that's another element that's important about the social groups that we belong to. Now, these social identity theories don't completely ignore the fact that there's also an individual, and that there's sort of such a thing as individual psychology. So we can move from the sort of social identity idea of the we, the us, to the personal identity idea of the I or the me. So I'll do that now and talk a little bit about the cognitive approach. So there's some cogs coming out of a brain, just to kind of make that point. This is about the kind of internal workings of self and identities. We've talked about the social workings of self and identity. What about the internal workings? Now, there's, again, lots and lots of different ideas and models in this field, and there are probably 2 or 3 that have been particularly influential for me. And I've included a graphic from a paper by Martin Conway and Catherine Loveday. Martin Conway is a memory researcher and academic, and particularly interested in autobiographical memory, those memories that are of particularly important experiences in our everyday life, the sort of standout experiences. And his model and others like it basically say that the self is something that sort of comes from our autobiographical memories. Our autobiographical memories come from the experiences we have in our everyday life. This is kind of what the kind of graphic on the left shows. It shows our episodic memories, our memories of complex events in our everyday life, falling into this sort of store of autobiographical memories across different lifetime periods, across different types of event. These then feed into our internal sort of model of ourself, our self-images, our life story, our beliefs, our values, our attitudes. Now, what I really like about Martin Conway's model is that memory not only forms the sort of facts about ourselves that we can kind of recall and talk about, but it also informs a sort of a goal system. So those of you sort of familiar with sort of cognitive psychology, this is more like an executive system. We have a self in place at any given moment, which is active, and which has particular goals, particular aspirations, particular feelings, particular beliefs. So right now I'm in kind of work mode. I'm in my presentation mode. I'm connected to my experiences and memories of experiences in rehab and research relating to identity. I'm aspiring to do a good job and convey information, and all of that's active in the back of my mind, that part of my identity. So I have this kind of working self kind of active at the minute, and it's motivating us towards particular goals that have meaning for me, and so forth. So we have this individual model of self, that our experiences are moment to moment, are processes, and patterns in those experiences are stored in our memory system. These patterns are organized a bit like tagging in social media, tagging people, places, feelings, meanings, roles. These help form a smaller set of patterns, the ideas and feelings we have about ourselves, our kind of self-concept. And then parts of that self-concept can be active at any given moment for a particular time, place, role. And it also helps us to anticipate what might happen in the future. So that's my kind of very thumbnail sketch of the sort of psychology of the self. And with apologies to anyone who has any psychological knowledge and appreciates kind of how superficial and how fleeting this account is. Okay, so social self, defined by the groups we belong to and the experiences in those groups. The individual cognitive self, based on the experiences we have in our everyday life, but kind of abstracted into this kind of concept of ourselves. So self and identity, a bit difficult to pin down. Looking at these models, it seems there are potential for us to have multiple selves or identities. We have a biological element, those memory processes can be localized into particular areas of the brain. They can be described psychologically in terms of sort of self-concept, schema, memory representations, and social. And these aren't competing explanations. They're explanations that exist all at the same time: biological, psychological, and social. Identity isn't defined just about what we do, but also our values, beliefs, our goals, how we connect with and how we see others, our feelings about ourselves, our experiences and our memories, and how we see the future. And these are all being constantly sort of recycled whenever we're engaging in an activity. You know, am I on track? Does this feel right? Is this the kind of thing I do? Are the people around me my kind of people? The back of our mind is constantly monitoring for this, even when we're doing nothing. So the brain areas that are involved in some of these processes particularly become active for people when they're not doing anything. So there's really interesting neurosciences research that came off the back of noticing what was happening in people's brains in scanners when people were asked to just rest in between tasks within an experiment. And it turned out that there was this sort of pattern of activation happening. It's called the default mode network. So we have this network in the brain that involves sort of frontal areas and memory areas in our temporal lobes, etc. That really is about kind of recycling and thinking about ourselves. So it's constantly there in our brains, in our psychology, and in the situations that we're in. So that's my little whistle-stop tour of the sort of psychology of identity. How does a brain injury affect self and identity? Well, I think probably I've got some hints there because I've talked about the brain very briefly. I've talked about psychology and I've talked about social situations that anyone with any sort of knowledge or insight into the impacts of brain injury will know it absolutely impacts across all of those three areas, the biology, the psychology, and the social side of things. Here are some of the things that people say that relate to their experience of identity change. How can I have any goals if I don't know who I am? I still find it hard to speak to my old friends because they expect me from old, and I am not me from old anymore. I have changed totally. Everything I do is a reminder. I feel mad and upset with myself. And from Harry Clarke's Psychological Care After Stroke, which is a little old now, but a great quote, we're not just legs and arms and a mouth. We're human beings with a mixture of emotions. All these feelings, self-esteem, self-worth, confidence, identity, they're all under attack after a stroke. You can feel vulnerable, frightened, and you can lose yourself. And I think in particular in this quote, the reference to legs, arms, and a mouth is a reference to stroke rehabilitation. And obviously it's important to be focusing on recovery of function in legs, arms, speech. But there's also this important element of that happening to a person with an identity. And these activities and these functions have meaning. So the effects of brain injury on the injured person, on the family are many and varied and broad. So obviously the brain injury can impact the skills that someone has to do the things that are important to us. But we know from social identity theory that if the person can't do the things that are important to them, it also might interrupt or disrupt the important connections they have with others connected with those activities. So that affects the relationships and the roles the person has. It might affect their opportunity to get support, to get feedback, to be reassured, to be helped. So that can make it feel like people have lost their identity, and sense of loss of identity and grief is a key experience that many people have. Alongside that, people might be spending more time with different people. Research shows that following a brain injury, the injured person and family members' size of their social network reduces and the membership changes. So they're spending more time with family and with caregivers and healthcare professionals. Now, if we think about identity as being defined by our relationships with others, do I feel comfortable or happy spending time with other people with a brain injury, with healthcare professionals, with personal care assistants? Are they like me? Are they like how I want to be? So you have that nature of change of social self. And then related to that, obviously, how I see myself might be changed. I might worry about how others see me and treat me. I might have lots of new thoughts or images or beliefs and feelings about myself, and particularly comparing to how I used to be. And that's another finding that comes from the research. There's a lot of comparison to how I used to be, how I am now, and negative comparisons in that way are associated with poorer mental health. People experience grief, fear, sadness, shame, and quite often as a result want to withdraw or avoid things. Bottom line, though, people might still have the same deeper values and beliefs as they used to, and they may indeed have positive experiences that are helpful for their identity. Really importantly, though, what we know from the individual psychology model is that not only do we have to have those experiences, but we also have to be able to remember and rehearse those experiences so they feed back into our identity. If we're building a new post-injury identity, then we need that kind of memory substrate of our experiences so that they're being rehearsed. So you can see the complex and multifaceted way that brain injury can impact on the person, and many of these things apply to the family as well. And here are some of the key things that family members talk about as significant impacts. And you can see things like loss or change of household roles, changes to living circumstances, disruption of social networks, etc., feeling isolated, how all of those things impact on the sense of identity for family members as well. So rehabilitation and identity. So we can think about all of those multifaceted aspects of identity and how they can be impacted by a brain injury. So what do we do in rehabilitation about this? So I'm going to go back to Kurt Goldstein's ideas about how the consequences of an ABI, where the limitations of a brain injury come from. And I'm talking about Kurt Goldstein because he has been very influential in holistic or comprehensive neuropsychological rehabilitation sort of theory. Goldstein's holistic theory says that identity operates to preserve sense of coherence of self, and that our identity operates to kind of seek self-actualization, that there's this sort of unconscious drive, our identity is always operating to kind of look after itself, and that's the kind of background sort of psychological function. So when we think about the impact of brain injury, the consequences of brain injury might arise from direct damage to the brain. In fact, they do. The loss of a particular ability can happen there. Now, because of our identity trying to kind of preserve sense of coherence, the moment these sudden changes happen, we're vulnerable to having what he calls an emotional catastrophic reaction, a kind of an emotional reaction of the self to this very significantly changed circumstance. So that can also have an impact on our ability to do things, having this sort of emotional catastrophic reaction in certain situations. And then the third thing, which I think is very insightful, is that because of that really awful catastrophic reaction of that sort of sense of identity sort of threat, people might well and understandably, in order to preserve their sense of identity, avoid situations that trigger that catastrophic reaction, and in so doing might lose abilities, which is a key thing. And I've seen this, and I've worked with people where, they've engaged in their physical rehab, sort of post brain injury, regained some great functioning, gone into the community, and after 2, 3, 4 years become progressively more withdrawn, more isolated, done less, and then lost that ability to walk or that ability to use the arm in that way as a result of that isolation and restriction of activity. I think we're really good in rehab with the direct damage to the brain bit. We're developing our ability to respond to emotional responses, but I think formulating the consequences of brain injury as being sort of distributed across these 3 areas is really key. And this comes from Goldstein's holistic theory of identity. So we were investigating this 15 odd years ago at the Oliver Zangwill Centre. We asked people with a brain injury to tell us about their current pre-injury and ideal selves, and compare and contrast those ideas about themselves. And we analysed this to kind of see what are the themes in there? What are the things that people are experiencing and thinking about when they're engaging in this kind of comparison of themselves to kind of how they used to be and how they'd like to be. And it was interesting because people tended to talk about their experience of themselves in terms of their experiences of themselves in the world. So in activities, in groups, in social situations. So for example, experiencing themselves as feeling part of things, or feeling like a waste of space. There was a proportion, I haven't put it on the slide, there was a proportion of how people saw themselves that was related to their activities that they did and the abilities that they'd lost. And then we also have this other area, which is kind of their internal process, being preoccupied with who I am or accepting of loss or difficulty. So it gives us a little bit of insight into how people are making sense of those changes. But the key and dominant thing is that is what we've said about our sort of theories of identity, that it's at one and the same time in the social situation, like when I'm trying to do this activity or when I'm with this group of people, and it's a subjective feeling about themselves, feeling like a burden on others, feeling like a waste of space, feeling part of what's going on. So it's a strong sort of feeling element there. I'm just going to skip over that one. So that gives us some key ideas about the effects of brain injury on identity and how we can think about identity and rehabilitation if we think about the effect of the loss of ability on identity, and then the catastrophic reaction and the tendency to sort of avoid things that trigger that catastrophic reaction. So what's the Y-shape model? This is the third part. I'll just talk briefly about the Y-shape model. So here's a picture of the Y-shape model. We published a few different variations of it. This is taken from a book chapter I did with Tamara Owensworth in 2017. The Y-shape model is a model of the rehabilitation process with identity at the core. It's a way of thinking about how we engage with people with a brain injury and their families around the topic of identity, and how we organize their rehabilitation around identity, alongside the things that we're maybe more familiar with, like goal setting and strategies, but how we make the identity element the sort of primary bit. So the first, so you start at the top, and the top is basically saying that for many people post-brain injury, they have an experience of self-discrepancy. They feel disconnected with their pre-injury identity, and they don't really know what their future identity might look like. And in particular specific situations, this feeling of discrepancy is highlighted. It might be when trying to cook a meal or returning to work, or different situations that press those buttons because the person is less able to do them in the way that they used to, and those activities or those situations are particularly meaningful. And we sort of formulate this in terms of this sort of creating a threat response. And of course, if anyone's in a sort of a threat state, then the first thing that you want to do is to create a safe situation. So making the rehabilitation environment compassionate, attentive, etc. And the process is one of engaging people in reflecting on those identity changes, making them feel like it's okay to talk and think about those things, and then working with them to test out some of their predictions and fears and worries that may have led them to avoid situations that trigger a catastrophic reaction. And by exploring, by kind of letting go of that discrepancy, you have this sort of reduction of this sort of threat of discrepancy, which is the sort of coming together of the top part of the Y. And once the person is kind of freed from this kind of threat of discrepancy, they have the potential to explore their life anew and engage in new or re-establish old opportunities in relationships. That's a kind of summary of that model. And we've also talked about it in terms of the wider system. So we can think about the relationships that happen and the multiple different perspectives, and how you can have kind of clashes of role and identity that can really destabilize how a family or a married couple, for example, are relating to one another. And again, it's a similar sort of principle of creating that safe space in which people can talk about and reflect on those things, and then having strategic plans within rehab that help people to move through that. So one of the ways in which we've done this is to help the person with the brain injury predict what they fear might happen in a very specific situation, make a plan to test that out, do it with them in a way that facilitates them to kind of observe and remember, and then reflect on the outcome. And when we reflect on the outcome in particular, we might ask questions like, well, what did you learn about you? Or what did you learn about what other people might think of you or how other people might see you? And we might also ask, what did you learn about what strategies or skills might be helpful? So it's creating and structuring rehabilitation around sort of experiments in identity, working on very specific particular tasks. Okay, so I'm beginning to move from the Y-shaped model into what can be done to help manage identity changes. So this is the sort of master slide that summarizes all of what I'm about to talk about, and I'll be talking about it sort of quickly, so I'll probably have to come back to sort of questions and what have you. Obviously, if someone's identity is limited by deficits, difficulties that mean that it's problematic for them to do that activity, but with strategies or with support they could, then rehabilitation strategies to minimize the impact of those limitations on identity-related goal areas is probably top of the list. For lots of people, however, there may be things that are really important to them that they're just unable to do, and that requires a little bit different thought. So one of the things that can happen is looking at, for example, the things that are unchanged for a person. In rehabilitation, we're really focused on deficits, changes, etc. From an identity point of view, that's just more threat for the person with the injury and for the family. That's just reinforcing the losses. So it can sometimes, for some people, the standard approaches we have in neuro rehab can be sort of threat activating. It's really important to balance that, not only with creating safe spaces, but also drawing on the things that are unchanged, like people's strengths and their values. And then the third area is creating safe places that reduce that threat and also provide opportunities for a kind of positive identity transition. Community connections, family involvement, and opportunities to not just be the recipient of care, opportunities to be the giver of care, the giver of help, opportunities to be valued. For example, engagement in peer support schemes. So thinking about the kind of the rehabilitation bit, and I've talked about the Y-shape model, you can use the Y-shape model itself in a kind of as a worksheet. And here's an example adapted from the Brain Injury Rehab Workbook, Winson, Wilson, and Bateman, which has got kind of copyable resources. But it's the idea of kind of taking that Y-shape model as a tool to work with family or with the injured person, so they can be thinking about kind of, well, what was I like before the injury? How do I see myself now? What about the things that haven't changed? What connects me to the old me? What might be possible in the future? And then if that is possible, or if new things do start to emerge, what's going to help to nourish that and sustain that? So you can use this as a little bit of a worksheet around those things. And talking about and thinking about strengths and values, this is a sort of a key thing, because if we relate our identity to doing a specific thing, driving, for example, comes up in some of the people I've worked with TBI or a particular work role, then loss of that thing equals loss of identity. However, if we change focus and say my identity is tied up with the values I have, and the thing that I did was a way of enacting those values, then if I've lost that thing, if I can find a new way to enact that value, then all good from an identity point of view. So distinguishing between the doing and the value, that the bit of the identity that's connected to that doing, is really key. And quite often we can find ways of working with people to support them to enact their values despite being less able or unable to do the thing that they used to do. Of course, there might be areas, as I said before, where there's supports or strategies that might help someone to do a thing. And obviously, in terms of, in this picture, identity 3 and 4, provide the support, offer the strategies, the person might be able to do that thing again. Great if they can, but if they can't, then we're in the realm of working with people on their values. And then finally, the final part of this morning's talk is thinking about contexts for positive identity change. And there's a few different ideas here I'll skip through. The first one is the humanizing healthcare approach, and this comes from the work of Caroline Ellis Hill and others, really thinking about those aspects of experience that foster humanization. And so you can kind of use this as a little bit of a checklist, because if you're engaging in humanization in your setting, in your rehab setting or in your service, then you're likely going to be fostering that sense of identity transition and making it a safe place for identity for people. So there's a table here, but basically we can think, excuse me, do our activities in our center value uniqueness of the individual? Do they value togetherness and connection between people? So yeah, do our activities value uniqueness, togetherness? Do they foster sense making? Are we helping people to kind of own and reflect on their personal journey? Are we creating a sense of place in the location that we're doing our work? Are we fostering a sense of belonging? So I find this a really helpful framework for thinking through these things. And we've applied some of those principles in work that we're currently doing around supporting family members, creating opportunities for family members to tell their story and be heard using creative materials, and also opportunities to share their stories with others. So without getting into particularly sort of complex therapies, I think some of these humanizing things, being with others, being creative, sharing stories, are all things that any of us might do in any of the sort of contexts that we're in. And indeed, the work that we're doing is about supporting these processes in a way that could potentially be shared across different contexts, and it isn't about having a particular sort of therapeutic expertise. And then the final idea in this is about gaining well-being through social connections, and this comes from research conducted by a clinical psychology trainee, Georgina Berger, now qualified. And essentially, this was about the experiences that people had joining groups and participating in things. Some of them were Headway centers participating, but other things as well, things like community gardening projects, disability surfing group, a variety of different things. And people talked about how joining these groups at the right time, when they were ready, with support, practical and emotional, helped them move out of this sort of cycle of loss and sadness and disconnection on the left through to a cycle of well-being, where they're engaging in activity, they're connecting with others. In connecting with others, they feel more accepting of themselves, they feel better about themselves. And over time, just sometimes the physical activity of what they were doing, but also the psychological motivation, helped to reduce the impact of the losses, but also help them to reduce the amount of support they needed in engaging in those activities. And even if it wasn't something that people felt that they wanted to do forever, it gave people this sort of sense of adventure, this spirit of excitement or anticipation about things that they might try in the future. And it opened them up to thinking, oh yeah, I might give that a try, to trying things that were different or new. So in summary, self and identity, it's a big, complex, messy thing, lots of different theories and ideas, and most of them would say that we have multiple selves and identities. Threat to identity after brain injury, and thinking about identity as under threat after brain injury, means that our starting place in working within the injured person and their family is creating safety, being humanizing in our responses, being compassionate in our responses, and giving people the time to sit with where they're at, not jumping in too quickly with the goals and the strategies and the change talk and the deficit talk. It means thinking about what's continuous, what's unchanged, as well as what's changed, and using ideas about exploration, adventure, and creativity to help people generate new hope and possibilities in their lives. Connection with others is super important, including peers with ABI. Services may need to work together across agencies to create a range of spaces and opportunities for people without ABI and their families. And across all of this, for the brain injured person, opportunities to share the experiences that they've had to support their memory for those new experiences. You know, one of the things that we do in our groups is we rehearse the stories about the things that happened. If we don't have those experiences, then we don't rehearse those experiences, you know, in groups. So we want those positive experiences, but we want the people to share them with. And for people with brain injury, you might need support for that. And I think Bonnie Kate Dewar's talking about memory in the next webinar. So I'm sure she'll be in her talk have lots of ideas about ways in which memory can be supported. But it's another key element in thinking about the injured person. We must remember the needs of families in their own right, and working with the whole family is a key part of identity work, in my view. Thank you very much. I think I've gone slightly over, well, more than slightly over, but thank you for your attention.